All right. Rich Casanova back in the studio here in Atlanta for Global Podcast Studios. And I have the honor and pleasure to be joined by Mr. Dewayne Hart. You've probably heard about him. He has a podcast that's really making things happen on that podcast. And he's the author of the book on the subject matter, as well as YouTube channel. And I mentioned earlier in another episode, you're becoming kind of a bit of a media mogul, right?
Yes. I'm becoming a media mogul, but I am enjoying having these discussions about cybersecurity, but to take it to that next level where I can talk to people that are making a difference in the industry. I've been told now that I sound like I'm on CNN.
Right.
People are saying that we really like the questions that you ask.
Yeah.
And I can tell listeners out there, the more you engage into cybersecurity, it becomes intriguing and you learn a lot. You know, I learned a lot when I was writing the book because I didn't realize how much information I had in my brain cell until I started to write a book. But, you know, just looking at some of the trends in cybersecurity now and where we're headed, looking at the government is making changes, looking at the workforce development making changes, and one piece that's making changes definitely is businesses now. Businesses are definitely making a great change when it comes to cybersecurity.
Yeah, because that's impacting across the entire spectrum. If all factors or all sectors of the business industry. We talked in the last episode about healthcare and government issues in terms of cybersecurity. For this episode, we're going to be talking about organizations, and this is according to a global report, organizations with mature cyber approaches have more impact on trust, efficiency, brand operations, talent, and even revenue. All of those words that you just mentioned could be an entire episode. I was fascinated by this article you shared with me. The whole premise of about a company organization, it can become a differentiator between your competitor, if you will, right? Or you just got to keep up with the times. Because if you operate an entity of any kind, you got to think about the employees and your talent. You know, they got to know that you're the watchdog in terms of attacks and cyber attacks in particular, right? Because if that organization is attacked, that's going to impact potentially the employee, their livelihood, because it's going to impact your revenue, right?
Yes, because here goes the way I like to look at business. Because you're the mediator between cybersecurity and your customers.
Yeah.
So if you want to look favorably to gain business, people are concerned about whether their data is protected.
Yeah.
Corporations or your clients are concerned about the same because your clients may just depend on you to protect data from clients that they own because of the sharing agreement that you have in place. So that's why a lot of times businesses have to focus on their operational level agreements, their privacy level agreements, and their service level agreements. Now, one of the things that I've always liked to say is that as a business, you really have to look at the way that you approach cybersecurity because we're in a different stage now. We're not in this stage where, guess what? It's those IT folks' problem over there. Right. Cybersecurity is at the fabric of all of technology. Corporations depend on technology. So you can't separate cybersecurity from technology, and you can't separate technology from the business.
Right.
Because your customers are wanting you to perform. And if you're not abiding to different audit regulations, or if you're not practicing safe standards when it comes to cybersecurity, it can be detrimental. And it's just as simple as a bank. A bank is not practicing certain standards, and that's a major cyber attack. Well, imagine everybody wants to take their money out of one major bank and actually deposit in some other major bank.
Right.
The first bank lost all of its customers.
Yeah, it's hard to recover from that, right?
Yes.
The repercussions can go on for quite some time. Also, I would be as bold to say that the new currency is trust, right, between you and your customer, right? And it's often been said in the past that it can take decades or years to establish trust and to gain that trust, but it can be gone in a single moment, right? And that's where, if you're not watching what's going on in these online transactions, this online data, it's on you, right? And once that trust has been breached, good luck in gaining that back, because there's you may not think you have competition, but like you said with the bank example, one misstep, the customers are not likely to, especially when you're dealing with their finances or their medical records or personal data, right? I mean, if you're running a dry cleaning company and you mess up on a shirt here or there or whatever, right? Or if you're running a retail operation and there's a glitch or a problem with the product, it's easy to return, and people will kind of give you the benefit of the doubt first time. But it's a little bit different when you subscribe to the fact of cyber security.
Right, because if we look at the type of exploits that we have in the industry, type of vulnerabilities, looking at your threat vectors, and also too looking at most, if not all, organizations are pretty much involved with building public-facing systems, right? So you're always going to be at risk. So if you're always at risk, then you as a business always have to assume, okay, how can I maintain my customers? And part of that is to at least let your customers know that you are a cyber-safe organization.
Right.
There was someone that asked me a question about a couple of weeks ago. It said that when are you guys going to fix cybersecurity? Right. So I kind of told the person, I said, listen, the word fix don't even operate in the world of cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Because fix is like taking a wrench and turning a screw. And I said, we can't use a wrench in cybersecurity.
Right, yeah.
I said that the more appropriate way is to say that, how can we stay ahead? And now, this is what businesses have to do, is to stay ahead. So to stay ahead, there's a strategy I always like to use, right, is that if you find ways to increase protection and to lower risk, you can mature your cybersecurity programs.
Right.
All right. That is the opening statement. And part of that is to make sure that your programs are operating, make sure that you understand operations, making sure that you look at your talent acquisition process that you have in place, because you want to bring the best in the breed of people on. In the cybersecurity mindset under chapter 17, I talk about the value proposition mentality, which is so important, because what that means is that you as a business is trying to build your capabilities and let your customers know that they can depend on you. And, once you build your value proposition profile,
right,
you become the high value asset. So that means that if you're like a government contracting company,
right,
if you're a high value asset, that means the government trusts you.
Right.
And if they trust you, then they can do business with you. And that's when you gain more opportunities in this contracting space with the government.
Right.
So I've always liked to state that the value proposition mentality works well, because at the end of the day, the goal of a business is to make money.
Right. Be profitable, to deliver all their products and services at a fair market value, and to treat their customers and their employees fairly. But also the onus is on them to protect, in this case, their cybersecurity, so that it maintains that the value proposition, as you said, that they're offering to their investors and so forth. I thought it was interesting, that question about, when are you going to fix cybersecurity? It's kind of like saying, when are we going to fix traffic accidents, right? Or traffic jams. That's just, whenever you have people involved, there's going to be human error, right? But it's what you do about it, what the precautions you take in advance, right? What systems you, in business we call SOPs, or standard operating procedures, right? It's that if you haven't taken any of those precautions in advance and don't have any of those protocols in place, then shame on you for that organization, right? Your customer would, is more likely, I think you would agree to this, is more likely to kind of give you a second chance, or if you've done everything you can, right? But if you don't put that in place, whose fault is that?
Well, I like to look at this and state that part of the idea is to go and focus on making things better. All right.
Right.
The word fix, we're gonna slam that and we're gonna throw it out the window.
Right.
All right. That's not the mindset that actually needs to be in place, because part of a business engagement when it comes to cybersecurity, and I always make a statement over and over again, is to go and look at the downstream liability. Looking at the fact is that your return on investment should be very high, right? But you have to adapt and you have to adopt cybersecurity. So I'm going to explain the differences between those two.
Okay.
When you adapt, so that you understand as a business that there's going to be changes in your environment. And now this is where you adapt, and this is part of your operational resilience, because your customer depends on these systems to stay online. Your customers have to have access to public-facing systems, right? Now, when you adopt, right, so that means that there's a standard out there that came out that's going to help you operate.
Right.
Some of these standards are pretty much like the NIST cybersecurity framework that's in place. Maybe you adopt that standard and you bring that on board.
Yeah.
All right. Because as I said,
give you a benchmark, right?
Right. Because as I stated before, cybersecurity is the fabric of technology. Technology is the fabric of business.
Yeah. You can't separate, and it's just a matter of what we're dealing with today's business environment.
Right, right. So when you look at the nature of cyber threats that are escalating on a daily basis, business has to stay focused. Now, most people will look at this and say, man, it's so difficult. When it becomes difficult is that when someone is reactive in this process. I've always stated that if an organization, excuse me,
well, while you pause for that thought here real quick, again, you're listening to Dewayne Hart here, live from our Atlanta podcast studios, the Global Podcast Studios. Rich Casanova alongside Mr. Dewayne Hart, author, speaker, YouTube guru, podcaster, all that content. If you want to check out any of his media, including his book, just go to DewayneHart.com. We're coming up here in this episode, again, we're going to be talking about cybersecurity, cyber planning. I'm interested on your perspective of that. But if I might ask you this question, I mentioned earlier that global report. I'm interested in your take on this. Included in that report was based on responses of more than 1,000 cybersecurity decision makers holding various C-suite roles across 20 countries. A new reality is taking shape. What's your thoughts on this new reality on that subject?
Okay. If I don't do what I'm supposed to do, my company's going to lose money. All right. Because as we look here, there's a title. It states cyber and enabler of business outcome. So cybersecurity is the input to your business outcome.
Yeah.
As a corporation, you go work on profit. You want to make money because that's why someone owns a business.
Right. Or you're out of business if you're not doing that. Yeah.
So the fabric behind you is cybersecurity. So you have to take it seriously. So the 1,000 cyber decision makers were speaking based on business development and trying to transform business to an area where cybersecurity operates. Because at the end of the day, and I'll say this over and over again, cybersecurity is pretty much here to stay. There is never ever going to be a point where we say cybersecurity is gone, because cybersecurity leaves us when two factors happen. Number one, hackers no longer exist. Two, when risk no longer exists.
Right, exactly.
When we get When we can completely get rid of
It's a
those
zero
two,
threat. Yeah.
right? That's when I can entertain the term, why can't you fix cybersecurity?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Until then, stay tuned. But so before we talk about cyber maturity, because I want you to address that subject. But again, closing thoughts on this global report was just fascinating. Some of the stats. So, case in point, 58% of organizations are planning to increase their cyber investment in the next year. That's a staggering number, right? And on top of that, they also mentioned that 70% of respondents indicating cyber is on the board's agenda on a regular basis, not just an employee, or you mentioned the IT guy, so to speak, right? But the actual board of that organization, the governing entity, 70% of those respondents saying that's on their agenda for that board. And that board really controls all of the decision making, all of the outcomes of what that business is going to look like in the upcoming year. So I don't know if Andy have any thoughts on that, but also on cyber maturity. What is talk to us about that? What does that mean in layman's terms, or what's the impact of that?
It's growth.
Okay.
Just because you haven't been hacked, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're safe. All right. So, part of your maturity process is to always try to improve how your organization operates. Now, cybersecurity operates on three different folds. It is your administrative, technical, and your operational standards.
Okay.
When you look at the administration, that is a management strategy that you have in place. How can you better manage cybersecurity? Looking at the technical area kind of goes back to a statement that you stated before about those investments.
Yeah.
Technical means that there's new type of application systems and technologies like cloud and artificial intelligence platforms that organizations have to invest into. Here's the reason why. Because as you bring on more customers, you're going to need more support from IT. So that means that you have to mature your systems, and you have to grow your system, and pretty much you have to change the way you operate, because you want to satisfy your customers. But the human eye can only look at so much.
Yeah.
So that means that your investments have to focus on newer technologies. This is where digital modernization comes to surface. And in the cybersecurity mindset, I wrote about digital modernization because I saw that artificial intelligence, cloud services, Internet of Things, looking at zero trust and all these other different type of technologies that are surfacing, all of them had to be in place. But I also want to make note that zero trust itself is a methodology, but I just wanted to include it in the discussion here. So as organizations think about cybersecurity maturity, they are trying to build their organizations up and to go and look at the legacy way of doing business and say that we need to transform the way we operate.
Right.
Part of that means that they can do an assessment because there is a CMMI module. There's all kind of cybersecurity maturity frameworks that are available. And now the United States government is focusing on government contracting companies and saying that you have to be part of our maturity framework. And you as a company has to be very mature at the same, at a certain level, prior to doing business with us. Now, looking at that statement from business to business,
right,
organizations want you to be mature to a certain level because you have to do your audits every year.
Right.
These financial audits are a beast.
Yeah.
PCI, DSS audits, and looking at the government and your FISMA audits that you do. These are all part of your maturity process and trying to carry your corporation to the next level. But you always have to look at your return on investment as you begin to mature.
Yeah. So, much like an individual, you're not operating in a C-level suite as you operated as a high school kid, right? You got to mature yourself, but also the company. you're not likely to be using a fax machine or telegrams anymore, right? You're operating on the World Wide Web, and all of the advantages that it has, and all of the efficiencies. But at the same time, you have to be prepared for the flip side of that. Let's switch gears now to cyber planning. Talk to us about that, which I thought was interesting in terms of not just you have to defend against and respond to cyber threats, right? So those are having those contingencies in place, I would imagine, when you think in terms of cyber planning?
Yes, you have contingency, but part of your planning process goes into a proactive strategy.
Okay.
Because you being proactive and taking a look into your strategic, operational, and tactical plans that you have in place, right? Because to defend against cyber attacks, you always have to be at the front line, right? Because as of now, if we take a deep dive look into cyber warfare and looking at combat warfare, because they are best friends, what's been replaced on your first level of attack for combat warfare is cybersecurity, because the normal type of combat warfare would actually use missiles, artillery, and those type of engagement to go into destruct your enemy's infrastructure. But now it happens with the push of a button. Through cybersecurity, you can carry out these sophisticated attacks. You can carry out some ransomware attacks, and it cripples the power and utility systems and also the communication systems. So what happens now is that the military forces that are being affected, all their communication systems are down. So when we look at planning then, so what you're trying to do is to go and look at things like various incidents that happened in the past, looking at your state of cybersecurity, taking your tools that you have in place and seeing where your most weak and vulnerable areas are. Right. And planning that out, because if you're not planning then, so that means that you don't have a foresight and try to see where you're going. See, what I like to do is to take a lot of the different strategies that I used in the Navy,
right?
Because I worked in combat warfare. And part of the planning process is to go and make sure that the ship could stay afloat. Those smaller things you have to do,
right? I'm not I haven't been in the military, but I think that's kind of an important
because
thing to make happen. Yeah.
Because when you press that button
right.
to actually engage an enemy aircraft,
right.
You kind of want that missile to go off
right.
and to its target. So that means part of that planning process is to make sure that things are operational, things are in place. That's part of your situational awareness. That's part of your risk-based thinking. That's also part of transforming your mindset,
right?
And realizing that if you're not wearing your hacker's hat, well, you need to put it on.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that's a hacker's hat out there for everyone to wear.
Absolutely. So, well said, Mr. Hart. I would say, would it be fair to summarize in terms of cyber planning would be that old adage of, plan for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Because you never assume that you're safe.
Right.
All right.
So let's switch gears again. Let's talk about we mentioned the board engagement, about a board of directors getting involved. I don't know if that's a recent phenomenon, but they used to, there's probably a lot on their plate in recent years. But cyber, it's almost this mantra of cyber first, right? Because if that, God forbid, if that attack happens or that breach happens, it's like they say about we mentioned healthcare in our last episode. I heard something recently. It was fairly new premise to me, but it goes back to the beginning of time, if you will, right? They said that a man with a health issue can think about nothing else, right? But if you don't have those health issues, there's a million opportunities available to you, right? So again, if you're operating an entity, we've been talking about business and enterprises, if you're attacked, it's like all bets are off in terms of it can be so severe that, we talked about a cyber hostage scenario, right? Where they have you captive. You really can't be, you're not worried about the color of your product anymore, or the packaging, or the design, right? You're worried about how are we going to get out of this, right? How are we going to survive?
Well,
right?
It's called your survival tactics. All right. Here's the goal. Here's kind of the way to look at your survival tactics. When people go camping, they make sure they pack their bags with most anything they can think of, from phones to batteries, making sure they have enough gas in the vehicle,
right?
Making sure that they have an emergency kit, flashlight, right, and so forth, right? So you're making sure that you plan it out and, that you packed and ready to go. The same thing about cybersecurity. That same concept applies. When you activate a system, right, you always have to make sure that you have your protection standards in place. Because protection itself means that you are practicing a cyber safe environment. When you look at the different type of cyber attacks, looking at your exploits, looking at the vulnerabilities, looking at the hacker tactics, looking at whether your organization is a risk-conscious organization or not, all of that affects your maturity level. Because It can be as easy as an employee that does not want to embrace cybersecurity, right? Yeah. That could be a downstream liability.
Right.
It's just that simple.
We got a few minutes remaining here in this episode, so I don't know if you have any closing thoughts or comments. One thing we opened with, which I thought was just fascinating when we approached this topic, was brand reputation, right? So it goes back to we mentioned earlier that trust can take many years to establish, but can be lost in a moment, right? And it's hard to kind of recover that brand. I don't want to mention any particular brands, but there's certain companies where they were, it may not be cybersecurity per se, right? But their brand was tarnished and damaged. It's really hard to kind of come back from that, right? It takes beyond a PR stunt or a PR firm to kind of clean things up, right? So, and we've heard those horror stories about a brand going wrong or doing something inappropriate. But now, and you can have different opinions on that. It can be an opinion of like, well, that was controversial or it wasn't controversial. But in terms of cybersecurity, if data was breached, there's no question about the outcome of that, right? And the impact of that. So maybe, I'd be interested in your take on cyber attacks and, a brand's reputation.
I could carry a long podcast on this, but I'm going to make this very simple. Your brand is who you are.
Right. Yeah.
And your name is who you are.
Right.
The idea is to always have that as a forethought.
Right.
Because down the road, when you do your cyber planning, when you're looking at your operational strategies, you always should be thinking about downstream.
Right.
If this incident happens, how does it affect my organization?
Right.
It goes beyond someone just getting access to a database server.
Right.
Right. Because you have customers that use that database server. But let's take it a step further, is that when the root cause analysis comes out and someone finds out that it was a brand new database server that you put in place and you did not configure it right because it had a default password or something like that, which is simple.
Yeah.
But a problem like that can cause a lot of problems.
Right.
The public goes, you know what? Why did they do that? Because that's simple. Everyone knows you're supposed to change your password prior to you, putting that database out to the, access of that database just coming online, right? So what organizations have to do is to go have that forward thinking. And I've always make the statement that is that downstream liability. You think downstream.
Right.
Because one of the issues with a lot of cybersecurity environments is that is that when they find a weakness or if they find a vulnerability, they only stay surface on that particular issue. Here goes one here. Now this is technical, is that if you have a public facing vulnerability, and if for instance, that particular vulnerability changes your channel from HTTPS, which is a secure channel,
right,
over to HTTP.
right.
Now, here's the problem. You're using two different ports. Port 443 is dedicated for a secure channel. So now what you have done is that you have changed it to a non-secure channel. So if it's a non-secure channel, it's a gateway to come through the enterprise and it cause all types of problems.
Right. I mean, from a consumer standpoint, I think most people are aware of that HTTPS providing
Right.
that at least a layer of security. Without that, and we think about just an e-commerce site, but it's not just e-commerce. It's the data that's being housed on that server, whatever, right? And as a consumer, I'm thinking about if you're not looking out for your company and your company's security, you're probably not looking out for my security.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rich has just explored into the hacker's hat.
Once again. Well, I learned from the master himself, right? The guru. I hate to use the word guru, but this guy knows this subject matter, right? And from the book, best-selling book, author on the cybersecurity mindset, to the podcast, the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast, to his YouTube channel, to these Q&A sessions. If your organization, I'll give a pitch for yourself, right? Because you don't usually self-promote necessarily. So if you have an organization, entity that is keeping you awake at night, thinking about the what ifs, this guy has the answers to the what ifs, and is going to let you sleep a little bit more comfortable at night. Yes or yes?
Yes. I always have an answer. I always have some strategies for cybersecurity and companies themselves. But, I just want to bring up another topic too. Outside of everything I do, I have a consulting firm.
Right.
I am growing it, and I procure government contracts where I focus on risk management and your security engineering, your cybersecurity advisory, vulnerability management, and so forth.
Right.
Is to help organizations understand how to roadmap cybersecurity. And, when you have these audits and other different type of tasks that you need to do, this is what Seamless comes to surface here.
Right.
Is to go and help you channel and roadmap cybersecurity, because what I do is I take the information I have in the cybersecurity mindset and I put it into practice.
Right.
Because the cybersecurity mindset is a part of pretty much everything I do, because it's the core.
Yeah.
And those 20 high-level chapters are transferable to many sectors and areas of cybersecurity. And there are people that have not been involved with cybersecurity, have picked up the book and read it and told me that they just can't put the book down. And I am equally excited about that. But you know what is more so exciting is that people are now beginning to understand cybersecurity, right, by reading the cybersecurity mindset and listening to the podcast, the live streams, and other media outlets that I have as well too.
Right. Yeah, it's not just this. You mentioned earlier that cyber talk is really in your wheelhouse, right? So if you want to talk cybersecurity, check them out. And we're going to close. And again, just check out DewayneHart.com for all the resources we mentioned, as far as in addition to reaching out. If you have a question, you can submit a question right there on the site. And again, check out all of the media we mentioned and stay tuned for next episodes. Again, Rich Casanova on behalf of Dewayne Hart. We look forward to listener feedback, your comments, suggestions, ideas for new topics and our new episodes. And stay tuned once again and check out DewayneHart.com.